Hi, so this is going to help you try and revise the Russian Revolution, or at least the period leading up from the First World War, sort of 1916, 17, up to the October Revolution of 1918 and the 1917, sorry, in the short period after it, where Lenin established or tried to establish control over Russia. So I'm going to deal with five key things there. The first is why Russia was doing so badly in the war and how that affected the Tsar's loss of control. So I'm going to look at the problems in the war, why the Tsar was a problem, and the terrible chaos on the home front in St. Petersburg, the strikes and so on. Then we're going to take a look at why the February Revolution of 1917 happened. And in particular, we're looking at shortages in bread, which led people out onto the streets, strikes in the major factories, and of course, mutinies of soldiers who perhaps should have been loyal to the Tsar, leading to this February Revolution, the first of two revolutions in 1917. Then I'm going to ask the question, well, who actually ran Russia during those months in 1917 between the February Revolution and the October Revolution? Was it the provisional government? Was it the Soviets? Was it the peasants? Was it the army? Was it the workers? So having looked at that, going to take a look at Lenin and the Bolsheviks and this incredible drive of Lenin and his supporters to actually have a revolution in Russia and seize power themselves, and how they were going to do this. And finally, having seized power in October 1917, what plans did Lenin have to actually get control of the rest of Russia? We'll look at three things there: his plan to end the war, his plan to create a secret police to arrest all political opponents, and his plans to sweep away the other parties of Russia and this new assembly, the Constituent Assembly. So first of all, let's go back to the First World War. Russia was pretty much on the verge of collapse, certainly by the failure of their big offensive they planned against Austria-Hungary in July 1916, the so-called Brusilov offensive. There was a major shortage for the Russian army of shells, of machine gun bullets, of guns. Only 1/3 of the Russian soldiers had rifles, which is kind of an amazing statistic when you think of it. So Brusilov, his offensive failed in July against the Austro-Hungarians, 1.4 million casualties. Even the size of the Russian army couldn't sustain casualty rates of that kind of order. And of course, the German troops seemed to be more efficient, better at fighting, better equipped than the Russians. So whenever Russians came up against the Germans who were supporting the Austro-Hungarians, the Russian army was pushed back. So in this situation, the Tsar, well, from 1915 September, the Tsar decided to leave his base of St. Petersburg, and he was going to be the one to command the armies. Now, this was a major problem because he kind of put himself at his base, Mogilev, which was kind of hundreds of miles away from the front and hundreds of miles away from St. Petersburg. So he was out of touch, and he wasn't a good commander. Not that Russia had any particularly great commanders at that time, but of course he got blamed for the defeats. And subsequently, what about the scene in Petrograd? Who was in control of the government? Because the Tsar certainly wasn't. And the perception of people and the politicians were that his wife, the Tsarina, who happened to be a German, and of course Russia was at war with Germany, so all sorts of rumours there, and this very mysterious sort of mad Russian monk called Rasputin. And he was hated by the politicians, by people in St. Petersburg, and really, even though he was murdered in 1917, it was also at the end of 1916, it was kind of thought that these two controlled Russia, so it didn't look very good for the Tsar. Now let's go to the chaos on the home front. The Russian army. Well, why was there chaos? 13 million Russian soldiers joined up to fight the First World War. That's amazing, that number. And of course, most of them were peasants. What does that mean? Not enough people to harvest the grain, not enough people to plant the new crops. So, of course, there was a problem with food. And also factories. A lot of factories closed, couldn't make weapons because everyone had gone to be soldiers. Now, you know that transport in Russia was very poor, not many railways. So even where there was food, it couldn't get to the towns to be sold. So there were stockpiles, and that meant shortages in places like Petrograd. And prices in Petrograd were very high. There's a great source in your book, I'm not quite sure of the page, but it does show pictures of how much things cost before the war, 1913, and then subsequently afterwards, 1917. So 5 rubles, a day's wages, could buy you a couple of bags of flour in 1913, but in 1917, with all the shortages, it would only buy you 1/3 of a bag of flour. So people went hungry. And not surprisingly, the discontent spread. So that meant they went on strike. The workers in big cities went on strike. So in the winter of 1916-17, there were loads more strikes in Petrograd. Situation is very, very difficult to control. So this all leads us to the February Revolution of 1917. Now, why did that happen? I think first of all, you've got the bread shortages. I mean, people, women in particular, would leave their houses in the evening and they'd get into a queue because they'd heard bread would be available in this shop the next day. And of course, they'd queue all night and suddenly they'd be told there was no bread, and this caused amazing discontent, a particularly cold winter. And this therefore led to women sort of complaining to their husbands and men, and on February 23rd, the women textile workers went on strike as a direct response to this bread thing, February the 23rd, 1917. Now, also, there was a major issue with the other factories going on strike. And in St. Petersburg on the 7th of March, this huge steel factory is called the Putilov Works. The workers there went on strike, linked up with the female textile workers. So really, you've got in the city of Petrograd 250,000 people out on strike in February, March 1917. Then, of course, well, how do you get chaos, people are marching. So the idea is the army garrison in St. Petersburg, the soldiers who aren't fighting, will keep order, they'll be loyal to the Tsar. They're ordered to fire on the crowd and people die, but eventually the crowds remonstrate with the soldiers. And early on, 26th, 27th of February, the soldiers begin to refuse to obey their officers because they're peasants too. They don't want to attack people that are sort of perhaps part of their families or friends. So the soldiers mutiny in the Petrograd garrison. The Tsar hears of this in his headquarters, and Mogilev decides to try and come back. But by then he's lost control. He can't get back to St. Petersburg. On the 15th of March, his train is stopped and he has to abdicate. So now you have a situation where there's no Tsar, and into his place comes some kind of provisional government. A provisional means, until we get something else. It's led first of all by Prince Lvov, and then latterly in 1917 by a man called Kerensky. So the question is, did they control Russia? Who did control Russia? Well, on the surface, you'd think the provisional government, now taken over from the Tsar, were the people to control Russia. So why is this? Well, first of all, they had a plan. Well, we'll have these great new elections. Russia didn't have many people entitled to vote. This time, everyone in Russia will be able to vote, and we'll have the freest, best country in the world. But it's a great plan, but they waited until November for these elections. That's a long, long time. So the second thing, well, we make Russia more free. We'll have no secret police. We'll just have free press. Anyone can say anything they want. We'll just throw the prisons open, let all the Bolsheviks out that the Tsar had, Tsar's secret police, and imprisoned. So Russia's now a very free country, lots of discussion and debate. And thirdly, we'll honour our relationships with our allies, Britain and France. We will continue the war. This new enthusiasm will defeat the Germans, sweep them from the field, a new offensive in July. So that's what the provisional government had planned. But while they had a bit of power, they didn't have significant power. Who did? Well, of course, these organisations called the Soviets really had a lot of power. They had sprung up in big cities and other places all over Russia. And Soviet is the Russian word for council. And people would come together. So who did that mean? It meant workers who were fed up with situations. It meant soldiers who were also thinking they wanted the same things. Intellectuals, politicians, they banded together. These were very noisy, vibrant, lots of discussion. If you were a great speaker, then you can make yourself heard. And these were key organisations. I mean, they decided things: should we go on strike? Should we stop work? Should we make a petition? All over Russia, the Soviets are spreading up, and they tended to be the organisations that could control vital transport links. So actually, the Soviets had significant power in Russia after February 1917. And then, of course, what about the peasants? Well, all over the vastness of Russia, the peasants heard about the Tsar going and decided when the Tsar went, well, perhaps his power and the landowner's power should go. So many, many places, peasants were seizing the land from the estate. Actually, this meant probably ransacking and burning the landowner's house. Didn't happen everywhere, but loads and loads of places. So there was real discontent in the countryside, and peasants were grabbing land. Then, of course, the workers, well, still shortages of bread, they still want more money, and so they want to say things and they want to strike. So factories are going on strike more and more. It's a freer place, more discontent. The workers, of course, controlled the routes in and out of Petrograd, so the trams, any railways, and all that kind of stuff. So the workers have a lot of control, and of course, they're represented through the Soviets. And then finally, of course, the army. Well, the army, their offensive in July of 1917 failed against the Germans. The lasted a few successful days, but then, of course, the army broke down, and that meant soldiers deserted in their tens of thousands back to their land, which they wanted to look after. And where there wasn't desertions, the soldiers formed Soviets, their own councils, and they kind of really stopped listening to the officers, and it was the Soviets who were really running things in the army. So you had this very confused situation in 1917, everyone waiting for this new Constituent Assembly to be elected in November. Well, of course, one man decided he wouldn't wait, and that was Lenin, and really the force of his character really drove his party, the Bolsheviks, to seize power. And this was really part of Lenin's ruthlessness. And of course, he'd come back into Russia from Switzerland via Germany. The Germans had let him in to cause a bit of mischief with their enemy in the war. And when he came back and he arrived in April, he said, well, I want three things. I want peace, get out of the war. I want bread for the workers, which of course very attractive. And I want land. So really that's allowing the peasants to have their land. Beginning in 1917, the Bolsheviks didn't have many followers, but you see a nice little table in your textbook there. You can see the graph's a bit of a wrong way around, but here you can see the rise in 1917 of Bolshevik support. So Lenin's policies do get popular. He also said, I don't want power to the Constituent Assembly. The Soviets is where I want power. And it was very convenient for Lenin because the Soviets was where a lot of Bolsheviks had got a good presence. If they didn't have the majority of members, well, they had good speakers like Trotsky. So Lenin could exert a control over the Soviets. He said, these are the real democratic bodies. These are what should run Russia. So that's what Lenin wants. Behind the scenes, though, he's preparing for revolution. He's driving, convincing his followers to try and seize power of this very fragile democracy. And that's what marked the Bolsheviks out from other communist parties like the Mensheviks or even socialist parties, that the Bolsheviks, driven by Lenin, were trying to seize power. And they failed once in 1917 in July. They tried to seize power, didn't work, and they were to have a second chance in October 17. They seized power. They got the sailors in St. Petersburg and the Russian fleet sort of centred there to support them. Lots of political discussions from these sailors. They got some army regiments to support them. And there really wasn't a lot of control going on, as you know we've heard before from the provisional government in St. Petersburg. So in October, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, with Trotsky helping and so on, seized power, and very quickly that power sort of seizure spreads to Moscow. So you kind of have sort of October, November 1917, Bolshevik authorities controlling two central cities up here, Petrograd, and here Moscow. So their centre of power, the axis of power. Now, of course, you know, controlling those two cities doesn't mean anything really, because what about the rest of Russia? Well, Lenin had these plans to control the rest of Russia, and here's what the plans were. First of all, end the war. It was not an easy thing to do. You can't just make peace, because Germany demanded an incredible amount of land from Russia, all of Western Russia, the most fertile areas. And Lenin said, give Germany the land, we'll get it back. Trotsky, Lenin's negotiator, refused to sign the peace. And he came back to St. Petersburg. Lenin said, no, you've got to go back and sign it. He made Trotsky. He said, we'll get this land back eventually. So in February of 1918, the Bolsheviks signed this peace deal at Brest-Litovsk, which basically stops the war, even at the expense of giving all this land to Germany. So that's one big thing. The second thing is the Bolsheviks start a new secret police called the Cheka. They want to crack down on their opponents, arrest them. They want to be ruthless. They want to sweep away political parties, and they're prepared to use any means, violent means of arresting, murder, to do that. So they start a new secret police. It's called the Cheka. And the third thing that Lenin does is to begin to destroy all other political parties. The biggest party are the Social Revolutionaries, the SRs. They are the party of the peasants. And in the new Constituent Assembly, they are by far the largest group. The Bolsheviks are only the second largest in these November elections. What does Lenin do? He lets the Constituent Assembly sort of gather together, and then he decides, I'm going to sweep you away into the dustbin of history. He gets loyal troops and he pushes them out in January of 1918, and he says, we don't want you. It's all power to the Soviets. The Soviets are going to be the body that will run Russia, and his new title for Russia is going to be the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And of course, well, a lot of people don't agree with it, and that sets up the Civil War, but that's another story.